Ready to see if the lathe will run, Valor? Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome back to the shop. I'm putting together a really quick video here to talk about a couple of things that I wound up having to research on the LeBlonde lathe that I'm putting into service. Now, there's 1,000 LeBlonde lathe videos out there, a lot of good restorations, a lot of, here's one we have for sale. This is none of that. This isn't even really how to use it. This is, hey, I've got a LeBlonde lathe and I've just put it into service. Now, what are the first things I'm going to want to do and want to know? This is a video to put all in one place all the things that I had to go research, and then was able to verify when I discovered that I had the manual. I didn't realize I had this when I first put it into service about a week ago, and so I had those, noob LeBlonde lathe owner questions that I wanted answered, and I had a hard time finding them. So I'm going to put them together here for you in hopes that it helps somebody else out. So this is my lathe. This is a LeBlonde Model 5C. It was purchased brand new in 1965. The serial number for these lathes is back here by the tailstock. It's stamped into the casting, the main casting body, and you can see this is serial number 5C239. If you have a number close to that, you can be sure that your lathe was built somewhere in the age of 1965. When I put this lathe into service, the very first thing I wanted to do was check and make sure everything worked. Do all the gears spin? Does it make any weird noises, etc.? So, because I had wired it myself, and it's three-phase, it was entirely possible I had the rotation backwards. And to know that, I had to know which way was forward and which way was back. I went and I researched a lot of videos online, watched different, hey, we have one for sale kind of videos, and I swear every one of them was backwards. I put the question out on Instagram, got some really good feedback, but unfortunately I was, still not convinced which way it went. Then I found the manual. And in the manual, up is what we would call forward, or counterclockwise on the head. And in this particular lathe, there's actually two notches up, and there is two down. And what those are is, for this lathe, which has an electric brake, center is off, next one up is neutral, and the last one up engages the switch and the head turns. When you go to stop, the first notch is just a freewheeling stop, and then if you go back neutral, that's why they call it neutral, and if you go to the bottom or go to the center, it engages the brake. Let's give it a try. Alright, so the phase converter's running, and if you watch the head back there, I'll lift up. First notch is nothing. That's neutral, or what the book refers to as neutral, and the next step up is running. So that, for this model lathe, is the correct direction for the switch. If I go down one, it's neutral, and then if I go to the middle, it engages the electric brake. The electric brake was an option, so yours might not have that. So now that I had it running and I knew it was going the right direction, the next thing was, okay, does everything work? When I first powered the lathe up, one of the things I was looking for was to see that the lead screw and the power bar for the power feeds were turning, and they weren't. They were sitting there just like that, nothing turning. No problem. That's not a big deal. They're not engaged. The question I had was, how do you engage them? I had a smaller version of this import lathe, significantly newer, and I knew that somewhere over in this world was something to engage it, but I didn't know what. Feed reverse up here was pretty obvious. This is what reverses the feed for the carriage and the cross slide, and I figured, well, this one's going to be pretty easy to figure out. So I turned the head and I made sure that it was engaged in a gear, and yeah, sure enough it was, no problem. The next thing I looked at was, is the quick change setup in a gear? Yeah, it was. Then, by looking at the threads and feeds chart here and the label that's on this particular knob down here, which is A, B, and C, I could tell it had something to do with the lower gearbox, or what they call the quick change gearbox, which is what drives both of these shafts. So I checked it and it seemed to be in gear, but I had nothing. So still having no luck though, I began to wonder what the deal was. Again, did some research on the web, found a very bad copy of a manual, and it described moving the gear on the feeds on the lead screw shaft. Well, what they were talking about is this collar right here. Just behind this cover is a gear that you have to engage. Now, I've cleaned all this up, but initially this was stuck. No one has turned threads on this lathe in a million years, and the manufacturer suggests that you leave it disengaged if you're not turning threads. In this particular case, I want to make sure it worked, but this was stuck. The way you engage the lead screw when this isn't stuck is literally just slide it. So I tried it again. Still nothing. I was getting a little discouraged. And then what I discovered, I'm going to put this back in neutral, what I discovered was this little bugger down here was between teeth. And if I turned the head a little bit, it would go that last little notch. Moral of the story is, make sure that's truly engaged. With that engaged, the gear engaged, everybody's happy. So at this point, I had it running. I knew everything was working. All the gears were working. The feeds were working. The lead screw, all that good stuff was all in good shape. So now it was, does it have oil? Before you can think about where to put the oil, you got to figure out what kind of oil you need. This is a subject for a lot of the message board discussions. But being that I have the manual, I'll read it to you direct out of here. So again, on the oiling page where it shows all the locations, it says, note, use high quality rust and oxidation inhibited oil, 300 SSU at 100 degrees Fahrenheit. 300 SSU at 100 degrees Fahrenheit was a measurement that was common in 1965. I don't know what SSU stands for. I did, however, Google the translation. I don't know what Now, SSU was a rating system. I don't know what it means, from the 1960s. I don't know how long it went on, but in 65, it's what they used. Thanks to the great Googler, I know that 300 SSU at 100 degrees Fahrenheit is today's equivalent of an ISO 68 hydraulic oil, or an ISO 68 oil. The next question is, where do you get ISO 68 oil? You can pick up the phone and call your local oil distributor, and they will be happy to tell you what products they have are this SSU 300, and sell it to you. But for a home shopper like me, that's a lot of work if there's a simpler way, and in this case there is. I live in a fairly rural area, so I have a couple of different farm supply places around, big name places, Rural King and Tractor Supply. Both of them have ISO 68 hydraulic oil listed on their websites and available. I picked up a 2-gallon jug for about $16 from Rural King, labeled right on it, ISO 68. There's no cleaners, no detergents, and it's marked as hydraulic oil. But it's the right viscosity, so it's what I'm using. You can buy ISO 68 on Amazon. You can buy everything on Amazon. So I'll put a link down below if you just want to click on that. Yeah, you can even get it shipped prime in 2 days. In my case, I drove by the farm place on my way home from work and picked some up. So now that we know what to put in it, where to get it, where do we put it? So the book, the book lists 15 locations. Now, my lathe only has 14 because I don't have the servo shift head in it. Mine's a manual shift head. No big deal. The areas that I'm going to talk about are 3 main ones and then 1 bonus one that I'm going to mention just because I think it's probably overlooked. The oil for the saddle is filled here, and the sight glass for oil level is here, and as you can see, mine's low. I gave it some consideration on how I was going to add oil to this, you know, a little funnel or whatever, lift this cap, it's a little smaller than a US dime. You know, how am I going to get oil in here? Well, I came up with a solution. The solution I came up with is this right here. And what this is a little transfer pump for differential oil when adding diff oil to a vehicle. You can buy them real inexpensively at any auto parts store. They got a nice convenient little hose and in they go. It doesn't screw onto the top of the bottle just right, but honestly, that's not that big a deal. Then I give it some squirts until she fills up. According to the manual, the apron oil capacity is half a quart. And I would have to say that this thing was downright empty. Perfect. Before we finish up our discussion about oil in the apron, the most likely reason why this was so low is because these have a little pump on them right here. And the manual tells you to give it a couple of squirts periodically, and this puts oil up on the ways. One of the places that I think is probably often overlooked, so I wanted to mention it specifically, although this isn't, and this is probably why it's overlooked, is this isn't one of the major places in air quotes where people think of to put oil. This is what the manual calls the back box. To oil the back box, you take out this plug. Now I believe, but I'm not 100% sure, that it's all one cavity. So we're going to take out this plug as well and see if putting oil in one gets it coming out the other. The answer is no, and it takes very little oil. It isn't a big reservoir, it's just a little spot in there where it goes, no big thing. The first places everybody thinks of to put oil is up here on the business end, and it is the 2 major places. The upper gearbox, or the headstock, this whole cavity has oil in it. And the quick change gearbox down here has oil in it in a separate area. So I'll show you where those go, because you don't fill them from the outside. You actually have to remove the end cover. So there's the business end of the lathe. And pretty quickly you can see that there are 2 oil cups. One up here for the headstock and one down here for the quick change gearbox. Each of them also has their own sight gauge. There's a sight gauge here and a sight gauge down here. In the case of my lathe, the headstock has got plenty of oil in it. The quick change gearbox, however, does not. So we're going to add some to it. The quick change gearbox has a capacity of 2 quarts. The vent is a plug right here. There it is, all filled up. I'll put the breather plug back in. And the quick change gearbox is now full of oil. From an operation standpoint, there's really only one thing I want to mention to you about this lathe. If you have one and you haven't started playing with it yet, you'll figure this out pretty quick, but it's different from my previous lathe, and that's in the dials on the cross slide and the compound or the top slide. These dials are what the manual calls diameter reading, and what that means is, if I turn this around to 0, if I'm cutting the outside diameter or the inside diameter of a part, and I turn this dial 25 thousandths, the next time I mic that piece of material, it's going to be 25 thousandths smaller. These are diameter readings. Some lathes read the radius. They direct read how much you're actually moving it. In this case, it's how much is being removed off of the diameter, either an ID or an OD. So just something to watch out for, depending on what you're familiar with. If this is your first lathe, this is what you're going to get used to. You'll never know any different. For me, it's going to be an adjustment. So now that you've got this oil, you might actually have a little left over like I do, and you're like, well, I guess there's just one more thing to store. Never bad to have a little on hand. But check the manual on your air compressor. You know that thing you've never changed the oil on since you bought it? This oil, for my air compressor anyways, matches the manufacturer spec. So I'm going to go do one of my worst PM neglects and change the oil in my air compressor. Alright, so we oiled it. We know how to get it in and out of gear. What else did I want to talk about? I remembered one more thing I wanted to tell you. As I mentioned earlier, I don't have the 4-jaw chuck. This is the only chuck I have. It's a 6-jaw, which will work just fine. 6, 3, it'll all work. But I can't do anything square, so I need a 4-jaw chuck. That brought me to the question of, well, what kind of head is in here? What kind of chuck faceplate do I need? On this lathe, a LeBlonde Regal from the 65 era. This has an L0 tapered head. It's got a threaded collar and then a taper on that. Hopefully, when you got your lathe, you got one of these bad boys. This spanner wrench is what's used to take the collar loose, and then the chuck comes off. So if you go looking for a new lathe, you're looking for something that has an L0 mount. That was it. Almost forgot that. That was really about it. So for grins, I thought I'd end this video by putting a cutter in it and making a few chips. But so far I've only found one cutter, and this was ground for something interesting. It'll make a chip if I have to, but let's see what else we got. We got an A-bomb size boring bar. That's sweet. A threading cutter. Well, that was admittedly not how I planned to end this video, but something I've been wanting to do, and I appreciate you being here to share it with me. So, for now, hope the tips are helpful if you're new to one of these machines, and thanks for stopping by the shop.